Okay. Basically, what we do in anatomy, we're building a body. You got the basically introduction stuff and we got that all of that done in that first day. I always do it a little bit differently. So I don't know why. I normally I would get into this in that first because it really lends itself more to lab. I am not into looking at slides. I don't know where you're going with your careers. When you look at slides of tissue, the science has a very formal name. It's called histology. When you look at cells, it's called cytology. So, and for whatever reason, at the undergraduate level, I have seen so many places where I have taught where they have the students take practical exams and look at a slide and tell me what it is. I am just not into that. We did that in medical school. Okay. I think it's a little ambitious. I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong, depending on who's teaching it. If they were doing a collegiate course in histology, which is some things we have proposed around here, then that approach, in short answer, in the lab, it's probably unlikely I'm going to use microscopes. In physiology lab, different. But anatomy lab, I can see better images of the slides here that they project. And that's the reason I mean, it's the only ones I would ever use anyway would be like bone and blood because they're just easy comparatively. They're self-explanatory. I'll give you some idea how it is. Nevertheless, we're going to look at tissue. So the first ones we look at before we get into specialized systems like muscles and nerves and certain glandular structures and the accumulation of different systems is we look at the basic tissues, covering tissues. And coverings are external and internal linings. Okay, you can be lining the interior of a blood vessel. You can be lining effectively an exterior structure, the alimentary canal, which is that hole through you is a hole through you. Okay, so you're lining effectively an exterior structure like your mouth, your anus, your whole gastrointestinal tract, but it's still technically exterior. It just happens to be a moist lining. We give a generic name to any moist lining. We call them mucosa. MUCOSA. They don't, or we call them mucous membranes. They don't always secrete mucus. So sometimes it's a misnomer in that regard. It's from learning about which one is and which one isn't. And then, but we have external linings, and that's where skin comes in. And the external lining they're referring to when we start talking about coverage tissue is epithelium. And so we're going to endeavor today to look at how we classify epithelium. That's the anatomy part of it. Little bits about their function, where they're found. And it's so terribly important. I'm sure I said to you before, the most common area of cancers are epithelial tissues. They are the most rapidly reproductive tissues in your body, period. End of sentence. Okay? You replace your skin roughly it could be 14 to 30. Most people replace. Well, a skin cell here was born 30 days ago and is being stuffed. In your gastrointestinal tract, particularly the small intestine, every 3 to 6 days, they all get replaced. Stomach, small intestine, large intestine. But billions, with a B, cells every day get made and get stuffed. Cells, cells, cells. Untold amounts of stuff get stuffed. People aren't at all, they really don't know the magnitude of how much cellular construction and loss occurs on a regular basis. So we're going to look at the epithelial tissues. Then if we get through them, then we go to connective tissues, which certainly we'll be into on Friday. Muscle and nerve are their own units. I don't deal with it here. We'll get to it. And I mean, you can see that this is illustrated. It's hard for me to see. So, I mean, nervous, we're going to do brain and spinal cord. Muscle, we'll do our own units. But they're just showing you some of these boundaries between different environments. And in general, they protect, they secrete, they give off various fluids, materials, perspiration, mucus, lubricating fluids, if you will, things like that. Yes, you're going to see wells of filtration, lining digestive tract, other hollow, they say a hollow organ, respiratory, urinary, genitourinary, blood vessels. All of those are, quote, hollow organs. We have a lot of those. that are there. Inevitably, they are surrounded by mostly smooth muscle. It's a little bit different. So we don't really have active control over those, as it were. So you can begin to see what they are. Glands, and some organs are nothing more than glands. The endocrine glands are like this. And endocrine glands are potentially have some problems. I mean, for instance, like pancreatic cancer, which is a glandular cancer, is not a diagnosis. Okay, and then on the surface of the skin, the epidermis. Connective tissues are everywhere. They're the most abundant by mass, if you will. That's the second, if you will. I'll have more. So bones, tendons, and ligaments, all sorts of padding, fatty materials, all that wonderful collagen that's literally everywhere. You're going to find all throughout. It's just an immense amount. It's the most abundant of really of all the proteins in that regard. So we don't do it. But I mean, I've had a lot of students who have gone into the laboratory aspect, and there's a science in and of itself. There's a wonderful field if you're so inclined. And I've had a couple of students who, and they are pathology assistants. They do the tissue slides that the pathologist examines when they get specimens from the OR or from an autopsy, and they prep them, they cut them, they prepare them, they do frozen sections, which you're unfamiliar with. If you want, it's hard to see living tissue. So what you do is you put it in, typically in liquid nitrogen, fast freeze it, use very thin slices, plate it, and you can do it. Pathologists can do a quick read on a mass to determine that you've taken a tiny section out to determine whether it's cancerous or not. So that's called a frozen section. You get them about 20 minutes, half an hour, because the patient's under anesthesia. You don't want that to linger. So section, as you can see, means thin enough section, and that's the whole ball game when you want to see something thin. We do a lab in physiology with rabbit muscle, thin, less is more. So, and we stain them, and you'll hear me use the term artifactual. Artifacts are things that come from the processing. It can be and we're in a digital age now. Years ago, when I first started doing x-rays in my office, we used the old tanks. You dip them, just like the old photography tanks, before the age of digital photography and digital development, things like that. So we dip them into a developer, and then a rinse, and then a fixer, and then another rinse, and then something that would be a finishing tank. And all those things. So it was a wet system. Something you could see the x-ray pretty well. It's basically a photographic negative, but a lot of times you have something funny on it. That's called an artifact. So you'll hear me use, when I speak to you, the term artifactual, meaning it's there. I see it, you see it, but it really isn't of significance. It came from the processing that is there. Okay, and so we all know this in light microscopy. To see things, unless it inherently has color, and even if it does, like when we look at slides and physiology of blood, hemoglobin inherently has color, but we enhance that with using stains. And electron microscopy, you probably knew this, uses heavy metal coatings and different. I'm not as familiar with the technological stuff. We just see the slides. The only institution, when I taught for 5 years at Chatham, they had an electron microscope. I never saw anybody use it. But then I was just teaching, not doing any research. I don't know if they used it or not. Maybe they did. My guess is somebody donated it. I don't know if they did it. But that's not a put down. It's a wonderful learning environment. So voila. We're going to look, and this is transmission. You get this in micro lab, different kinds of microscopes. Usually that micro lab. Gotcha. Do you have Dr. Dress for that? Maybe. So basically, when you go through straight, you get transmission. It transmits the signal through. You can see a fine line of the relationship here with these kind of either microvilli or cilia. When it comes at an angle, that's scanning. Okay. It's the difference between the binocular microscope that we use in the lab is more oriented toward transmission, flat, versus when you use like the binocular microscopes that you can see, like a dissecting microscope, you get images a little more like that. So here, the electrons come at an angle, and you get, so you can sort of get a textural or three-dimensional kind of fun. So, sheet of cells that covers what I was talking about before. External, internal surfaces, I defined that. Glands. And this is where, and I won't go crazy about it, there's a lot of nomenclature. If you're going on in your careers at graduate levels, you're going to talk about tubular and acinar and simple and compound. Like, for instance, the parotid gland is relatively complicated. There are other glands that are relatively simple. Sweat gland is relatively simple. They're different. And so there are ways that in classical anatomy, you go about different ways of defining them as to what they are. I would never, I'm happy you know what the glands are. Okay? So different. And so and they'll show you some examples, and every text will do that. What do? Protect. The thicker they are, the more they are for protection. When they have one layer, easy name, simple. Simple and single would be interchangeable in the world of epithelium. One layer. More than one, multiple layers, we say stratify. And then we talk about their shape and where they're located and the shape of the nucleus to do the classification. So, pretty straightforward, not hard. So, if there are multiple layers, like epidermis, stratified. And then you'll see how we define it as stratified squamous. It has to do with the outermost layer, outermost being most peripheral. And then variations that are associated with it. So, absorption, tons of them absorb. If you go to your digestive tract, you're going to see it's called simple columnar. So that implies that not only can it absorb, it can process. Sometimes it just transits its way through your digestive tract. My favorite tract. If you haven't guessed, I'm a foodie. Wife and I are trying to make the perfect shrimp and grits. Andouille sausage. Great. New Orleans cuisine, any? Nevertheless. And so filtration, kidney, it's all about filtration. So they have modifications in these structures. They have tiny little holes in them. They're called fenestration. Fenestration is a little window. And in this case, it's a hole. If you're in surgery, I'm going to do a knee surgery, plenty of them, scrubbed in on a bunch. You take a fenestrated drape. That's a sterile drape. It's got a hole in it. Put it over the knee area. Some clamps underneath it to isolate the area. So fenestration is a useful term to know. Excretion, fine. They certainly play a role in that are there, and secretion. And a lot of times we see tiny little epithelial cells. When we get to the skin, you'll see one that play a role in light touch. When you have lots of them, you have very sensitive areas. When you have a relatively few of them, not so sensitive. So that's a really significant, when you do an exam, a neurological exam, it kind of looks like an old style compass to draw circles with. So it's got two sharp points, and you can measure, like you could anything, the distance between the 2 points in centimeters. Okay, we call that 2-point discrimination. Now, if you put that on your face, it doesn't matter how big or small, you know there were 2 points. You try it on the small of your back, where the skin's very thick, not a lot of nerves. You don't have a lot of 2-point discrimination. You know, you got something sticking me back there. It could be 2, 3, or 4, but you don't have enough individual sensors to tell you whether it's 2 or more. So there are certain areas that we map out that if you're going to go into neurology, you'd learn about all those things. I'm not bad in neurology. That would be stronger than weaker. Yeah, always good to qualify stuff. So tissue have 5 distinguishing characteristics. They have when something is polarized, it's different on one side than the other. I mean, I don't want to step on Dr. Buxton's toes, so to speak. I would like to when Liverpool beats Man United, but what am I going to do? Nice guy. So, for instance, so what we begin to see is that this is a squamous cell. How do we know it's squamous? Basically, you'll see it. This is called simple squamous. You have one right after the other, right after the other. It's got a fried egg appearance. Okay, so when they talk about polarity, they're all attached to what we used to call a basement membrane. Really, membrane is the wrong term. So this basement membrane in the old days is now really just a street, like a base layer. So we call it basal lamina, which means base layer. It's basically made out of protein. So we call this aspect of said cell the basal aspect, BASA. And the outer aspect that protrudes into the surface, if it's exterior, or if it's one of those hollow tubes, the blood vessel. Okay? We call the lumen, L-U-M-E-N. The lumen is so the cells are sort of, and if I have the worst handwriting in the world, I'm the worst artist. So envious of that. There's this guy who was doing all the graduate. I came in second in a contest to be hired as to doing the graduate anatomy at Chatham. And I mean, he's artwork you could put it in the museum. He was that good. He could draw everything perfect. Okay? That's polarity. So you have a basal aspect, and on the exterior, you have an apical. Basal and apical. With the base and toward the apex. So effectively, we have some amount of directionality that's there. We connect them, as you will see, in their terms that you truly got yourself black. Most of the time, they're connected by contacts here, depending how close they are, by contacts here. Typically, with different kinds of type, perhaps. More on that as we get there. Underlying them, they all sit on top of a layer of connective tissue. And I always abbreviate. You don't want to see my handwriting anyway. Connective tissue is CT. And this particular connective tissue, as you will learn perhaps once today, loose areolar, A-R-E-O-L-A-R, which means loose and airy, not a loose tissues don't have a lot of stuff going through it. Some cells, they have some fibers. This one has air. Some of them have fluids, some of them have. This is loose areolar connective tissue. And anywhere you have an epithelial layer, this is underneath it. So that's where it derives all of its nutrition, because epithelial tissues are avascular by definition. They have no direct blood supply. Even though they grow extraordinarily rapidly, it just depends on how easily their blood and nutrient supply gets through this boundary. So by definition, there aren't that many things that are avascular. Cartilage, for instance, is avascular. Cartilage is the frame, bone's made out of cartilage. When does bone make the transition from cartilage to bone? It's made by blood. Blood actually kills it. That actually doesn't. But it has innervation, and yes, it's highly regenerative. It even can regenerate without you knocked out a chunk of this. Here. As long as you have some cells that can crawl down from margins into the underlying loose connective tissue, they'll reform. Skin will do that. Pardon me while I demonstrate. This is proof that Lou is a klutz. This happened, I fell going up the steps outside the door. No, don't judge me. I have an old house with concrete steps. Nothing the dog did. I wasn't watching. I stepped on the dirt, twisted, wham, jumped over. I had to drain it at home. I had hematoma. You can take the boy out of surgery, but you can't take the surgery out of the boy. Okay? Now it's all nice. It's a nice scar's going to come off. But that's going to be, I'm curious to see how much of it is going to be scar and how much it will regenerate. Some of it will regenerate. Take pictures and share them. We have a crazy guy teaching us who shows us pictures of his leg healing. I mean, if you're going into a medical field, and I know everybody is, I mean, that's the kind of stuff should interest you. Watch things heal. Watch the colors. Watch where they bruise. Like this bad boy was bruised all the way from up here to here. Oh, and my wife's looking at that. My kids are looking at it. My God, damn. Did you see a doctor? No. Then you get a physician heal thyself. So some things are but in general, it's regenerative polarity. Top and bottom, apical surface, the free side, exposed to the cavity. Most surfaces are smooth, but some have finger-like projections. You're going to see that. Modifications, the classic place for microvilli, which means little fingers, digestive. It's all about surface area. I told this to the AMP1 students. I mean, think of your brain. Not that it has microvilli. We've having trillions of cells that we're managing to stuff into by folding it, okay, into a relatively small place called your cranium, your skull. That alimentary canal is roughly, I don't know, about your small intestine's about 20 feet or so. And it's about, I don't know, maybe 1.5 inches in diameter. And if you think of a wide garden hose, not super wide. Most hoses are like 1/2 or 3/4. You slit it and flattened it out. How big would it be? It would go from here to here, 20, 25 feet. Effectively has a surface area of a tennis court. That's because of all these special structural things that we will learn about that increase surface area. It's all about surface area. Microvilli are just lined with simple columnar cells, which you'll see in a minute. And it almost looks like a brush border, and that's where all those wonderful enzymes that, for instance, why you're lactose intolerant or why we're not. That's where the enzymes are. They're located on these tiny little cells covering these tiny fingers. It's a good thing. So here you have the basal surface, inward toward the body, deep, whatever. Okay, a lamina, so it's an adhesive sheet. It varies depending on where the structure is located with its composition. Okay, and that's what you see. For instance, this would be, now you can see, look at this is something that you would typically find in the aforementioned simple columnar. They have elongated cells. The nuclei are what you watch. Notice the nuclei are perhaps rectangular, so more oblong, elliptical. They're not circular, they're sort of elongated. The shape of the cell is reflected by the shape of the nucleus. This is probably these may very well be on top of, that may be microvilli at that brush border. Okay, here's the underlying connective tissue, very highly vascularized, lots of blood supply. Like I said, replace them constantly. So they typically form sheets. Almost, it's like a tabletop would be covered. Okay, so typically tight junctions and desmosomes, depending on what their function is and where they are. The more tight junctions, and we look at that again in cells. But and I'm sure you must have done this in cell molecular. Tight junctions and desmosomes are strength. They're like rivets. Tight, think watertight. Basically, it's like little staples. If you had a book and you had tapers in the old days, we'd staple them together before we transmit everything electronically. You put maybe one staple here, maybe one here. That's not a lot of tight junctions. Like stuff could slide through. So if you put staple, or sealed it, okay, then you have an abundance of tight junctions. That's what makes things watertight. You have a lot of tight junctions, that can form a barrier like the blood-brain barrier, which has It's all about the tight junctions, and it's reinforced by an additional layer of cells, as you'll come to see anatomically in the brain. Very, very interesting. So I mean, I hope you get some. I like to use what I fondly call creative analogy, stuff that makes it make sense to me. And I hope should make sense to you. It may not. Like most of the instructors, professors, whatever you want to call us, okay, information givers, 95% of us it works, and sometimes 5% it doesn't. One of the best students, I asked him about a particular professor. He goes, I get nothing out of his or her lectures. Great student. Took the MCATs. His highest grade in the MCAT section was in that discipline. Just it must have sunk in. But a lot of times teaching styles, you may not like mine. You just have to wait 2 years, I likely overtime. She's not going to let me retire. I'd be at home then. That would annoy her. Oh. Could be a bit. Hold for 1 second. Thank you. So, epithelial sheets, the connective tissue, okay, you have a base layer and it's collagen fibers. So if you really want to look at the, and this is not a big deal to me. Underneath that basal lamina, there's something called the reticular lamina. Again, this is just protein that forms a base or a framework. Not a big deal. It's a big deal to people who have disorders of collagen, and particularly autoimmune diseases. It can cause a lot of problems. A lot of the problems that we see, some of these hereditary diseases or unexplained diseases, in the old days we used to call them collagen disorders. We know now that they are principally autoimmune disorders. And we'll spend a fair amount of time with that. I mean, I don't know how much, if you had Dr. Merrill, how much he addressed that particular area. I know a fair amount about it. Basement membrane. So it's made up of basal and reticular lamina, reinforces it. And I mean, that's the beauty of it. Tearing, stretching, we have all sorts of adaptations. It's tough to damage skin. Skin's very resilient. You'll see, I've noticed this now as I've gotten older, it doesn't behave as nicely as you would like it to. So, and nowadays we're much more attuned to it. We have wonderful skincare lines. I love doing the skin unit. I think I impart a lot of information. Take care of your skin. That's why I go crazy with this obsession. I mean, I asked you guys if you watched the Pit on Max. What do they do? I mean, I understand you're in an emergency. I have never seen so much hand sanitizer in my life. It's like they're obsessed with it. And people, they're like, they see one of those. It's like, gravitating towards. Compelled to do that. Why? I don't know. I mean, it's great. If you're going to do that a lot, somewhere pause and use some skin moisturizer. Okay? Because you're doing a disservice to your skin. If you're going to do that all day long, try some moisturizer occasionally. Or get a hand sanitizing product that at least has some additives that will help with moisturizing. I don't suspect these are. These were undoubtedly on, they're buying the cheap kind. They get them at Dollar Tree or $1.25 tree or $1.75 tree these days. I don't know. Okay, but be on top of that type of stuff. Okay, here we are. The problem is the definition. A lot of what I teach about is cancer, because that's what happens when things get out of. It's the worst possible thing that can happen when things get out of hand, and more so in this unit than any other, because again, The most common types of cancers are carcinomas by definition. They are epithelial cells where the cell cycle has become so erratic that we have massive amounts of mistakes from a variety of things. Environmental factors, hereditary factors, unknown factors, a whole lots of things, toxins that we come in contact with, whatever. So don't observe boundaries. That's one of the things that makes them invasive. When they invade and get into deeper structures, you've got trouble, big trouble. And we'll go into that. Avascular, again, nourished by diffusion from underlying, nerve fibers are present, they regenerate. So what happens is when the cells begin to move, if they're in layers, or separately as they begin to slough for whatever reason. I mean, think digestively, all the stuff that's going on, chemicals and mechanical action, they're going to go. Whether they're abraded off, whether they're rubbed off, where they just expended so many chemicals and there's a harsh environment of chemicals, you're going to lose them. That's going to stimulate it. So friction, substances, that's what I'm talking about, adequate nutrients and cell division. And so now we get the nomenclature. Simple, single, stratified, two or more, unlimited after that. The second name indicates the shape. And again, in multiple layers, you will see it's the shape of the outermost or most apical layer. Squamous, squished, squashed. Actually, I think the derivation is shingled. Though you don't see shingled, but they may have correct. That was the lineage we learned, or the linguistic aspect of it, as it were. Flattened and scale-like. They are designed. They have a nucleus, but they have an abundance of membrane. That's surface area that's very permeable. Think lung. Oxygen and carbon dioxide, an abundance of movement, of membrane for them to move through instantaneously. It was almost without thinking that oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. If you get blood drawn, I mean, there's a tiny bit of oxygen in that vacutainer. There is. I mean, that venous blood immediately gets a deeper shade of red as soon as it comes out. The oxygen just grabs it. It's quick. It doesn't take much. Okay. Cuboidal, you're going to see the nucleus becomes more circular. And yes, it's more like a body. Not exact. It's not geometry class. We're not going to have a square. Okay, anything like that. But it's going to look like that. And then you add, and the more it's there, the more organelles that are there, the more mitochondria, the more lysosomes. It does more processing. It secretes more, absorbs more. And then finally, columnar increases the amount. You get more room for organelles. Again, the nucleus is, you might recall, is more elongated. Stratified, the shape varies, so we name it according to the apical layer. So here, simple squamous or squamous. I say squamous, not grading you on pronunciation. And here, inevitably, in stratified squamous, it starts either columnar or cuboid, and as it goes away from its blood supply, it begins to change because its blood supply isn't identical. This is called non-keratinizing because there's adequate blood supply, so you can see a nucleus in its outermost area, which you would get from inside your cheek, for instance. On the other hand, if in skin, you're going to get a transition where these cells begin to die and are replaced by keratin, the protein. Effectively, the cytoplasm changes into keratin. Keratin is a structural protein that's waterproof. It's like a watch, waterproof, shockproof. That's an old commercial for Bulova watches. Not ringing a bell. I don't blame you. I just see Rolex commercials. Yeah, I got my kid a Rolex. I cut one out of a magazine. I haven't worn a watch in forever. So here, squamous, cuboidal, and so it's both for the shape of the cell and the shape of the nucleus, and location plays a role, and the number of layers. So columnar isn't always, but more frequently, is toward the nucleus is toward the base rather than the apical area. Okay, so now we begin to get we have enough time for a few of these that are there. Simple squamous, flattened laterally. Not a lot of cytoplasm, a lot of membrane. Think like you got one of those eggs where you have the yolk and you have like a lot of white spread out. We have a flat top grill we use outside. Functions were rapid diffusion, kidney and lung. You'll see that when we start looking at kidney anatomy, we're going to look at the loops of Henle. In the thin layer, you're going to see that. The lung is classic. And what occurs there? Simple diffusion, oxygen and carbon dioxide. In the loops of Henle, it's all about water. So endothelium, lining of vessels, lining inside the interior of the heart. When we see mesothelium, those, remember we looked at the ventral body cavity? So those things we talked about, peritoneum, pleura, pericardium, those are all mesothelium type linings, moist linings that have a little lubricant called serous fluid. Okay, and so and on TV, there's still the lawyers are still advertising. If you've been diagnosed with mesothelium, originally it's from asbestos. We saw it with coal mining and things like that. So I mean, these are PI, or we call personal injury lawyers. It's how they make a living. That's why we see all those commercials. Oh, the biggest personal injury lawyer in the world, in the United States, wherever they are. Edgar and Company. I mentioned my daughter went to kindergarten. His daughter, he's 10 years older than I am. His second marriage. The lady came up with all Edgar's advertising. Was in advertising. He got to know and became his wife after he went through a divorce. And they had a little girl, and our two girls were in kindergarten together up in Squirrel Hill in the Jewish day school. I know you're excited to hear it. It's a long time ago. My daughter's going to be 40 in February. Voila, that's lung. How do I know it's lung? Because of that. That's air. And you want to see that. You want to see the tissue, and you want to see a fair amount of air. Because all of that is surface area. It's a very, very thin slice. You can't think three-dimensionally. But you see you have a nucleus, and then all you have is a ton of membrane, so oxygen and carbon dioxide. Where it's a little thicker here, you have more connective tissue, maybe a blood vessel is under there. And we'll look more at that. So that's what I mean. So we can do a much better looking at these slides. I'm sure a little stretching back up. Nobody's faster in this place with a microscope than I am. How old was I when I got my first microscope? That was after the chemistry set. It was what I did to the kitchen. The microscope had a little light. I'm not joking. I took one of our binocular microscopes. My 5-year-old grandson wanted to look at white blood cells. And even though his dad, like all my children, are adopted, okay, it doesn't fall far from the tree. It's that nature and nurture thing. Oh, he's a panic. He started kindergarten a week ago on Monday. As far as we know, the teacher has still not resigned. He'd be one of those. Just saying. I was that kid. Bow tie, suspenders, pocket protector. I was a nerd before it was fashion. You don't believe me? There is a kindergarten picture. See, nobody believes me. I'm not talking from my chapeau, as my dad used to say. So, simple cuboidal, more secretion absorption, glands. Classically, we see it in glands, tubules and glands. Okay, kidney. This is kidney 101. You'd never mistake it from a histological standpoint. This is something a grad student or a med student would look at. That's kidney. Right away. Okay, that's the lumen in white. You can see the circular nature of the cell. You can see connective tissue here. It's just the kidney is densely packed tubes and blood vessels. All it's doing is filtering blood all day. That's all it's doing. So it's like this, and so that's what I mean by it's very good at illustration in a sense, showing you a sheet that's there. Ducts and secretory portions are small glands on the surface of an ovary. These are the areas where you start thinking about prostate and breast, where you see things like that. These are the kinds of cells. And then columnar, you saw before, tall. Some have microvilli, some have cilia. Cilia are different. Microvilli are actually cellular extensions, like little fingers. And what creates the extensions are actin filaments. Okay, where cilia, like a flagella in a sperm cell, are made of microtubules. They don't protrude. When you see the illusion of hair, or what they call this fuzzy kind of a border that's there, understand it's different. In a bacteria, when they have a flagella, it's like a hair, or a pili, or a fimbriae. It's a protruding. These are intracellular appendages. They're just pushing out, and they're lined. Okay, so they're different. They're distinctly different. And a lot of them, when we see these, we typically find them in respiratory and in digestive. They secrete a lot of mucus. Those are areas that have a lot of mucus production. And indeed, because of irregularities in mucus, are very, very common. Unfortunately, very is the wrong term, but a common inherited, definitely bad disorder, affects both respiratory and digestion, and we discover it in infants. Its name is genetics. I think it's maybe sex-linked recessive. Cystic fibrosis. I'm giving you a genetics answer. Don't tell her. And so what do? They move mucus. See, and the microvilli move it, and mucus has a more protective role gastrointestinally, because the mucus is basically is very alkaline in certain areas and neutralizes the degree of stomach acid. So there's a protective nature. In your respiratory, the mucus traps as you might guess, traps particles and basically moves it. Okay, so digestive, gallbladder, glands, bronchi, uterine tubes. We rely on ciliated fimbriae, little finger-like extensions of the oviduct or the fallopian tubes, whatever you want to call them, same thing. And it creates eddies and currents because the egg is basically expelled into the peritoneal cavity, not directly in to the oviduct. It's unlike sperm. Sperm is a closed system. Eggs are not. That's where you can get an ectopic pregnancy and within the abdominal peritoneal cavity. Big anatomical difference, very significant. Voila. So here's that brush border. Here that's a goblet cell. Because it looks like it's narrow at the base where the nucleus is and wide where it stains differently, as you can see. And here you can see the cell. So it's very uniform. That is some kind of pit. In the stomach, we have what are called gastric pits. In the small intestine, we have crypts, CRYPTS. They have a fancy name. They're called crypts of Lieberkühn. And that's when you hear about people on chemo and radiation, those are the first cells to go. That's why they have diarrhea and lots of problems when they're undergoing radiation. Thankfully, they treated me, initially, not for what it did, with immunotherapies. And then the one that's part of the respiratory system, we'll end with this. Pseudostratified columnar epithelia. It is ciliated. It appears as multiple layers because the nuclei are at different layers. They all attach to the base. They don't all go to the surface. It's single layers, so pseudo, false. Lot ciliated, yes, goblet cells. Mucus. The difference between mucus and serous is the amount of protein. Mucus is sticky. Mucus can have other chemical properties, but in the respiratory, it's all about trapping particles and things like that. And it's all swept, but we see it mostly upper respiratory. Certain glands, testes have that as well. We talked about the oviduct. Here you go. Now that's cilia. They're actually a little bit more distinctive with a micrograph than the microvilli are. Microvilli are because I think they're larger and thicker. Here you can see the goblet cell, and you can see it looks like there's 1, 2, 3 layers. But if you look closely, they all go to the bottom. Like this one doesn't go to the top. That doesn't go to the top. Whatever. If you look closely, so that would be within the trachea, the start of the main bronchi, etc., etc. In the throat, In the mouth, it's a little bit different. And we look at those transitions a lot because different things affect them differently, as it were. So we'll stop there, and we'll hit stratified, and then we'll undoubtedly get on to connective tissues after that. Thank you. Have a good rest of your Wednesday. Lord knows I've got to do a whole week of AP1, 3 o'clock.